This miniature was primed and highlighted with an airbrush, though this was not necessary as I'll be base coating everything with a brush and building up highlights and shadows by hand. Here I start with the flesh, building up a thin base coat of scar tissue over 4 thin layers. You don't have to thin your paint this much for your base coats, but I find that when I do this and allow ample time in between coats to dry, I tend to get a smoother finish. Also, it doubles as extra brushwork practice, having to paint the same thing over and over again. I've gotten better over the last nearly 2 years since I've started this channel, but I still need more practice and experience. I know I can get a lot better. I just need to continue experimenting and I need more practical repetition. I moved to the shadow next, using a combination of scar tissue mixed with an even amount of orc blood before thinning it down to a glazed consistency. I then build up the shadows in the eye sockets, around the hairline, around the nose, under the bottom lip, and around the body as needed. I do this over 4 or 5 thin layers, slowly building up the shadows with the darkest placed under the arms or cleavage and underside of her legs and lower back. The upper body that would have a lesser shadow, I only apply 2 to 3 layers, so they're not as dark. Next, I apply even darker shadows with orc blood, following the same approach as the previous colors, but this time only adding it where the shadows would be the darkest, such as in her armpits, very bottom of her legs, and sparingly between crevices, such as her abdominal muscles, cleavage, or thighs. As an aside, this video will only be focusing on the flesh, red clothing, and the sword, though the colors I used for everything can be found in a spreadsheet excerpt that will be shown at the end of this video. The first highlight I apply is with a mix of the base coat color of scar tissue and equal parts of topaz skin. This I glaze over all of the upwards facing portions of the flesh, but I'm careful to leave some of the original base coat visible. This was one of the slowest parts of painting the flesh. I've noticed that when I get chalky finishes, it's usually during the highlight stage of painting, so I make sure I paint in thin layers here as well as allow enough time between the coats to dry. The video has been sped up here at 2 times normal speed to help minimize the overall runtime, but I'm painting slowly here as I have been in previous snippets. It really doesn't matter what I'm painting, I try to make sure I'm painting slow and deliberately, unless I'm working with speed paints or washes where you need to work fast enough to keep a wet edge for an even finish. The second highlight is thin topaz skin, and I add these highlights to the same places in the previous steps, but keeping visible a good amount of the previous highlight and base coat. As I add additional layers of topaz skin, I cover a little less each time to help concentrate the slowly brightening flesh towards the highest points. As I close in the final strips of highlights coming in the next step, the slight reductions of layers will aid with creating a smoother transition. The final highlight is done with a mix of topaz skin and ruby skin. This I apply sparingly as I intend this highlight to be the brightest reflections of light from the skin, and in many cases, such as on the abdominal muscles, I apply them as tiny dots or very minute thin strips. This I only apply over a couple of thin layers. I finish the flesh with a very thin glaze of scar tissue over just the highlights, leaving the shadows alone. I felt like the last highlight was just a little too bright. This helped to tone it down and hide some of the more egregious transitions. As a side note, I don't know what the hell I was doing with the thighs, but I built the highlights as if I were highlighting each of the quadricep muscles individually, where I should have done this as a large single cylindrical shape. This I have to come back to and fix later off camera. The red clothing will have a much simpler approach as I'm aiming for the same stripper look of latex that I did with the Holly the Christmas elf a few weeks ago, save for red in this case. I start with a base coat of crusted sore with a highlight of abomination gore. There will only be 2 additional highlights of pure red and pure red mixed with matte white for the extreme reflections. Latex tends to only appear to have a few shades, at least under the surrounding bright lights of the stage, so the red clothing doesn't take long. The biggest thing I had to remember was keeping the final highlight very thin and minimal, and orientating them parallel with the length of the limbs, then perpendicular where the wrinkles are most prominent. Maintaining a fine tip on the brush was important. I kept the video for this step at real-time speed to demonstrate how slow and precise I was trying to be. The brush I used for all work except with speed paints or washes in this video is a Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 1 brush. I tend to clean this brush and reload it with paint about every 3 to 5 minutes, as I feel that helps me keep a finer tip when trying to do fine work like this. For my next attempt at non-metallic metal, I follow a similar approach as I did with the hilt from the Dungeons & Dragons orc I painted earlier this year, base coating it with a mix of fur brown and fire lizard before highlighting it with fire lizard. The next highlight is done with demonic yellow, covering less area but really brightening edges and corners. This is followed with a little bit of shadow of fur brown mixed with oak brown, but because there is so little surface area for this metal, I try to keep the shadow very minimal. I add the last highlight with arid earth before adding a very thin glaze of fire lizard to help soften some of the highlights, much as I did with the flesh, before carefully adding just a little dark tone wash around the metals and in between the deeper crevices of the ornate design and the handguard. Finally, I spend half an hour trying to glue on a plastic bead to act as a counterweight on the pommel. I had to break this off and re-glue it half a dozen times before I got it on straight and finish out the base. This is the final result. For lessons learned, I should not have attached the wings until everything had been painted. Doing so would have made painting the scabbard significantly easier and quicker to glue that detestable bead on. For snow bases, going forward I'll need to varnish in areas I'll be putting down the snow terrain. I thinned mine with a lot of water to make it easy to spread and give it a slushy appearance, but by doing so, it reactivated the red ink that was used when I airbrushed this miniature. This red ink bled into the snow and tinted it bloody. I had this same issue when applying the wet snow against speed paints. Applying a varnish by brush would only add a few more minutes to the process, and bleeding will never be an issue for me again. And finally, here's a quick peek at all the materials and paints used in this project. That's going to wrap it up for tonight. I hope you learned something or were inspired to start or expand your own collection. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and if you like the content of this video and would like to see more, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm Jim with Working with Miniatures. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I bid you a fond farewell. Till the next video.